Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our museum event tonight with the Birmingham Museum. My name is Jen Hassel from the Baldwin Public Library, and we've got our archivist, Donna Casaceli, here this evening. Just going to let everyone get logged in. Again, please mute yourself if you're at home. I guess for the folks here in person, if you wouldn't mind muting your phones as well, in case they ring during the program. I hope those of you who are joining us from home are nice and cozy. I know it's a pretty cool rainy night tonight. I'm going to just stall for another minute or two to let any extra folks join us. We have I don't know if any of you joined us. I know it was earlier in the week. It was Tuesday for the Masters of the Air program. It's not as high profile as the Cranbrook Architecture Series. Because tonight's presentation having to do with transportation. I know we had a World War II program on aviators. So I feel like it's been a month of historical programming here at the library. So if anyone who was here for that, I hope you enjoyed it. And this one as well. I don't see any new folks coming in, so I am going to monitor the chat while you guys are hearing the presentation. If you have questions, just throw them in the chat, and I will make sure to pass them along to Donna before the program's over. Same thing with our folks in the room. If you have any questions, hang on to them or raise your hand, and Donna will address them at the end. And with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn off my video and turn things over to Donna. And yes, I thank you very much for the chat. I will mute the folks in on Zoom that have not yet muted. I'll do that in just a moment. All right, Donna, it's all you.
All right, well, welcome. Good evening. So this is the Birmingham Museum's lecture series, Transportation and Transformation. And it's about how transportation shaped and continues to shape Birmingham and its people. As we begin this program, the Birmingham Museum would like to recognize the Indigenous heritage of the land that we occupy at this moment and honor the Indigenous people who have lived here in Oakland County. We invite you to join us in acknowledging the Anishinaabe people, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, who occupied this land at the time of European settlement, and the Indigenous peoples who preceded them. So tonight, our talk is Birmingham's early aviators and their exploits. I'm going to explain how they helped bring aviation travel to the masses. Though I'm only focusing on 6 individuals tonight, there were other Birmingham people who were part of this movement. So don't think that it was just these 6. But I do wanted to focus tonight on Eugene Heath, who flew with the Wright brothers, Ralph Coriel, who was part of the 96th Aero Squadron during World War I, Harry Brooks, Edna Ferguson, and their friends, who took to flying in their teens and changed how we view flight today, and Jane Briggs Hart, who pushed the boundaries of flight with her desire to reach the moon. And then, of course, Maurice Lohmann, though he was not an aviator, he was an engineer who exemplified the age of experimental design in aviation. So the first aviator that we're going to look at today is Eugene Wild Bill Heath. Now, he was born on a farm located on the northwest corner of 13 Mile and Southfield Roads in 1879. He attended Birmingham schools in his youth and lived here as an adult. Now, while growing up on the family farm, he took great interest in mechanics. And as soon as he graduated, he would go into the automotive industry. And in 1902, he began working at the Packard Motor Car Company. He worked in Detroit until 1908 when he was transferred to Memphis, Tennessee to run one of their Packard plants down there. It was in Memphis that he became interested in aviation after watching several air shows in the area. Now, the first air show that he attended was held over a week in April of 1910, and it featured Glenn Curtiss, Charles Willard, and James Ward. These 3 men were pioneers in the aviation world. Glenn Curtiss started out building and racing bicycles, but moved on to motorcycles in 1901. He began building engines in 1902, and in 1907, he set an unofficial land speed record of 136 miles per hour on a V8 powered motorcycle of his own design and construction. That's kind of fast for this time period. But that same year, Alexander Graham Bell was actually also interested in aviation, invited Curtiss to develop a suitable engine for his lighter-than-air experimental craft. By 1908, Curtiss himself had taken to the air, and he continued flying in air shows, doing stunts, but also designing and manufacturing planes, including the Curtiss JN-4 Jenny, which was used in World War I. Now, Charles Willard was actually taught how to fly by Glenn Curtiss. And in 1910, he was considered the very first person to fly over downtown Los Angeles, and also was labeled the first barnstormer. Now, just to clarify, in the earliest years, barnstorming was a little bit different than it was when we think of barnstorming. So when you see a lot of the videos, barnstorming to begin with, the barnstormers, they flew wood and fabric aircraft, lighter than air. And their tricks were more about the skill, basically doing loops, diving, soaring, and other dangerous maneuvers. The barnstorming of the Roaring 20s, those were heavier than air aircraft, and those were the stunts that we think about: the wing walking, the acrobats, and even games of tennis across the wings. So Charles Willard was that first set of barnstormers. The third person that Heath saw was James Jimmy Ward. He was also another barnstormer, and his skills in the air caught the eye of Curtiss in 1910, who took on Ward as a test pilot for the Curtiss planes. Ward was well known in aviation circles, and when World War I broke out, he was actually hired by the US military to train pilots for the war. Now, another, and I just love, I have to show this because of the cat. The second air show Heath attended occurred in December of 1910, and it featured John Moussant and Mademoiselle Fifi. Now, Moussant was an American aviator of French parents, and his cat, him and his cat were actually known as the world's most daring aviators at the time. Moussant and Fifi, she was also known as Captain Kitty, were as famous as Curtiss and the Wright brothers. Fifi would be the first cat to fly over the English Channel, the first cat to fly around the Statue of Liberty, and she reportedly meowed happily whenever she was interviewed and her pictures were taken. Moussant even outfitted his whole plane with sisal rope seats for her and bolted a litter box to the floor for her use. Now, Moussant was not just an aviator. He designed the first all-metal airplane, though it never flew, and he appeared in scientific journals, comic books, and even women's magazines. Just 2 weeks after Heath saw Moussant in Memphis, Moussant was killed in a plane crash during a trial run for a race in New Orleans. Fifi was not on the trial run, but she did continue to fly as co-pilot with Moussant's sister Matilda, who was also a well-known aviator. The field in which Moussant was killed eventually became the Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport. This airport still carries the call sign MSY, which is a tribute to Moussant. The M is for Moussant. After that December show, Heath went to Arkansas to treat his rheumatoid arthritis, and while there, learned about another man in Memphis who was interested in aviation, a Lewis Mitchell. Now, when Heath returned to Memphis, he reached out to Mitchell, and the two formed an aviation partnership. With some financial backing from people in Memphis, the two went to Boston and ordered two Burgess Wright Model F airplanes. They also made arrangements for flying lessons at the flying school. Heath started his instruction on May 30th, 1911, and after 45 minutes of training, he was flying solo because it's kind of how long it took. Heath and Mitchell then formed their own flying circus, which was called the American Aviation Company, and they traveled around the United States performing for crowds. Heath even gave his own father a ride when the circus performed here in Birmingham. It was over a week in June of 1912. On October 23rd, 1912, while Mitchell and Heath were performing at the Alabama State Fair, Mitchell lost control during a spiral dive and he crashed. He died on impact. Now, Heath witnessed the crash well above. So Heath was higher above Mitchell, saw him crash. Heath would come, bring his plane down safely, and try to sort of console Mitchell's wife, who was at the crash as well. Heath would finish out the contracts that they had for the flying circus for the rest of the season alone. And then he would come back to Birmingham to recoup after his partner's death. Now, throughout 1913 and 1914, Heath flew in exhibitions, and by 1915, he was flying for John S. Berger, who managed flying expeditions around the United States. In March of 1915, Berger was contracted to deliver planes and supply pilots to Pancho Villa, who was the leader of the revolutionary forces during the Mexican Revolution. This would be one of the first wars, really, where the airplane was used as equipment to fight the war. Now, Heath went along with two other pilots. They flew 3 Wright planes that were going to be purchased by the revolutionaries. He was only supposed to give expositions and to show what the planes could do. But after about 5 weeks in Mexico, and after he was shot at by both sides, he kind of like, nope, I'm out. And he left back for the United States. He did continue touring during 1916, showcasing how he could actually throw rose bouquet bombs. So he would just take bouquets of roses, and he would bomb targets on the ground from his plane. At one demonstration, the outline of a ship was painted on an open field, and he hit 3 out of the 4 targets that were painted on the ship that was on the field. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, because of his abilities, Heath was actually put as a senior civilian flying instructor for the Army. So he was a civilian, but he did work for the Army. After the war, Heath continued barnstorming until 1920, when he made his last flight in Memphis, Tennessee. He gave up his wings, moved back to Birmingham, and raised his family. He took up farming and painting. He did return to service during World War II as an aviation inspector in Michigan factories. So he did work through both World Wars. Heath was inducted into the early Birdmen. This is a group of pioneer aviators, which included the Wright brothers, Curtis, Moussant, and others. In an interview in 1954, the Birmingham eccentric asked Heath if he would like to go up in the air again. And Heath replied, "No, thanks. I'd like to live a little longer." He eventually passed away in 1959, and you can visit him at Greenwood Cemetery. So now our next aviator tonight is Ralph Coryell of the Coryell Nursery, the Coryell Subdivision, and the Coryell Estates. Coryell was born in 1892 in Lansing, but he moved to Birmingham as a teenager and went to school here at the Baldwin High School and graduated. He would go on to the Michigan Agricultural College and graduate with his Bachelor's of Science in 1914, where he then returned to Birmingham and was opening and working the Coryell Nursery. His father was also a nurseryman. When World War I broke out, Coryell entered the Army, and he was sent to France with the American Expeditionary Forces, where he was quickly trained as an observer bomber and was assigned first to the 90th Aero Squadron and then the 96th Aero Squadron. So I kind of want to explain what a World War I observer was, because I think that is a deceptive term for all the duties that Coryell actually had to perform. So yes, he did observe. The observers were positioned behind the pilot. If you look at this picture here, you can see the observer in the back portion. But they were required to report back on activities at train and stockyards. They were to notice troop movements on roads and anything else that could be considered needed to know for the Allied forces. But this was only a small portion of their duties. They were also expected to drop bombs from their seat by hand, and that is a bomber dropping over Germany. By hand using eyesight, basically as their targeting. And it's kind of funny because this is exactly how Heath flew through those rose bouquets. The observers, actually, they were almost perfect by the time the war ended, they were almost perfect in their targeting. The observer, however, was also responsible for operating the machine gun, which you can also see mounted there. It swivels around on the seat, and his job was to protect the plane and the pilot from enemy aircraft. He was also tasked with being the fireman. So if the plane caught on fire, he would have to climb out of his seat mid-flight and put out the fires wherever they were, whether on the wings or on the tail. So the observer was basically a barnstormer with real bombs and the added thrill of being shot at while wing walking. I'm not sure if I'd want that job. I think we went too far over. Yeah, okay. So while overseas, Coryell wrote many letters home, and we are so lucky to have several of those letters. The following letter was written to Fred, or the letter here, the one right in the middle, because there are a couple of them. Actually, he wrote to Mrs. Corton several times, but one of the letters that he wrote says this, quote, "Of all the delightful things one does, I like this idea of flying over the lines best of all. In the first place, you get a bigger ovation than a draft contingent going to camp, and in the second place, you are up where you can see things. When I first went over with my pilot, they sent up clusters of bouquets, one splinter of which grazed our wing, but most of which were scattered far and wide throughout the air. With a good old motor roaring ahead and a good plane underneath, one can laugh at their attempts to amuse and entertain us. Of course, there was a great diversity of things to look at, but there wasn't a world of time to sit and ponder over the scenery. In spite of the prevailing summer weather, the temperature above is considerably colder, inasmuch as we wear fur-lined teddy bears and remaining costumes to suit. Now, these bouquets were not the rose bombs that Heath was throwing. These were actual real bullets from machine guns. Think Red Baron fighter pilots. So they would have aces that would cover the German flights while they dropped bombs. So the squadron consisted of both bombers and these single piloted ace aviators. But those teddy bears also, those were special suits used to keep airmen from hypothermia due to the frigid air temperatures and the wind chill factors that they were exposed to in these open cockpits. He had a good sense of humor. Now, letters home were not Coryell's only means of communication with Birmingham. He also wrote in to the Birmingham Eccentric describing his adventures overseas. Now, this letter here, written to Marin Whitehead for the local paper, was printed in September 6, 1918, just 2 weeks after a bombing raid over Conflans, France. Now, this raid was part of a larger offensive, the Saint Mihiel offensive, that pushed the American forces to the forefront of aerial warfare. It is also the bombing raid where Coryell earned the Silver Star for distinguished and exceptional gallantry in the operations of the American Expeditionary Forces. As described by Coryell to his alma mater magazine, The Mac, the award was issued for events after the bombing, and the reporter wrote, quote, The incident in question occurred after a bombardment of Conflans by the 96th Aero Squadron, resulting in a running fight between the 96th and a German squadron, during which Lieutenant Coryell alternately shot at German planes and observed movements on the ground in the German sector. Now, this description does leave a lot to be desired, like, give us some more information. But the article does continue, stating that Coryell was on special duty with the Army Command Flight, and he worked directly under the 1st American Army during the Saint-Mihiel Offensive. I'm probably butchering that French term. And that he was one of 2 original observers who were still left with the 96th Aero Squadron at the end of the war, and that he ranked 2nd in number and weight of bombs dropped by all members of the American Air Service at the end of the war. So 2nd in most bombs, which, you know, is amazing. But in November, in November 1918, at the end of the war, Coryell was transferred to the 2nd Day Bombardment Group Air Service 2nd Army and acted as Group Operations Officer until March 1919. The Aero Squadrons had continued to patrol the skies over France for several months after the armistice, but Coryell returned home in May. He continued his work at the nursery and married Grace Gillette in 1920. While he did concentrate on his work, family, and serving in the Birmingham local government, Coryell still contributed to the ongoing discussion of how aviation could be used in the protection of our country and its possible use in future wars. In 1925, in a Birmingham-centric article here, Coryell explained how the military should have a separate air force and discuss situations where pilots and bombardiers could be beneficial in combat. Coryell was a visionary in his support of a separate Air Force division. While Great Britain saw the necessity right away and formed the Royal Air Force in 1918, the U.S. continued to group pilots with infantry all the way till 1941, when it formed an equal branch within the Army known as the Army Air Force. It wasn't until 1947 that a separate division was fully formed, and that is, of course, the United States Air Force. Now, Coryell died in 1975, and you can visit him at Greenwood Cemetery here in Birmingham as well. Yeah. So our 3rd aviator tonight is Harry Brooks. He was test pilot for Henry Ford and considered a 1920s heartthrob. Now, this is according to many accounts from the time, not just my opinion. Brooks was also another aviator born in Southfield. He was born in 1902, but he graduated from Baldwin High School in 1921. He was a football star, and he was voted most handsome boy for his senior year. Again, not my opinion, not just my opinion. But in the class predictions, which were printed in the yearbook, Brooks was destined to be an airplane manufacturer. And it only made sense because he and some friends built a plane in the basement of Baldwin High School, but it was never test flown because they couldn't get an engine for it. And I don't know if it ever made it out of the basement either. Brooks's fascination with flying was sparked when he went to the State Fair in 1911 and saw a Wright airplane exhibition. Harry was about 10 when he performed here in Birmingham, and a teenager during World War I, when the Birmingham Eccentric was publishing stories about Coryell's exploits on the front in France. And then never mind the fact that Detroit was home to Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, one of America's ace of aces, with 26 aerial victories during World War I. So Birmingham and its larger vicinities were quite the aviation center at this time. After school, Brooks decided that he was not going to stay on the farm, which saddened his father. And while working, contemplated attending the University of Michigan's very new aeronautical engineering school. He was actually working as a bus driver in Royal Oak, but started hanging out at an airstrip run by Glenn Hoffman. Now, Hoffman and Brooks soon became friends, and in 1923, Harry was hired on as a mechanic for $20 a week and flying lessons. Hoffman and Brooks were soon barnstorming together. Harry's job was to keep the World War I wood and fabric Curtiss JN4 Jenny flying and put on wing walking exhibitions. Harry even made a parachute jump for a crowd in Farmington. Now, during his time as a barnstormer, he was involved in a crash. It was the autumn of 1923 when he was flying with Hoffman over Farmington. Their plane actually hit what was called a bump. We would call it air turbulence today, which caused the plane to lose speed. And then the plane just sort of like dropped. It fell from about 200 feet and broke in half. Now, Harry luckily only suffered a deep gash over his right eye, but Hoffman came away completely unscathed from a 200-foot drop. Now, on July 4th, 1924, Harry took his very first solo run, which made him officially a pilot. This was a time before pilot's license were necessary, so he didn't bother. And then he started taking up passengers and teaching his friends, specifically Edna Ferguson, Hoyt Brown, and Milton Burrs, how to fly. In an interview with Brown on his friendship with Brooks, Brown described how Brooks said he would teach Brown how to fly if he bought a plane. So Brown bought an old Curtiss Jenny that was in very rough shape and needed a lot of fixing up. The photo on the left here on this slide shows a photo of one of the boys sitting on an upside down Curtiss. It was in the Brooks's family album and unlabeled, so we don't know if it was his crash with Hoffman or if it was the Curtiss Jenny that Brown bought for them, the one that was in rough shape. Either way, they're both those Jennies. Now, in September of that year, Brooks, Burrs, and another friend, Harry Kendall, decided to open a flying business with their home field located at 9 Mile and Southfield. And you may ask me, where is that field today? I don't know, and we probably will never know. It doesn't show up on any maps at the time period. And one of the simplest reasons is that many of these airfields were just mown strips in a farmer's field. And at that time on that corner, there were 3 farmers' fields. So it could have been on any one of those fields. This was a long time before we start seeing, you have to have a control tower, you have to have hangars, you actually have to have specialized airplane fuel pumps. None of that existed. If you could mow a patch, you had an airfield. The boys offered aerial photography, taxi service, stunt exhibitions, and pleasure trips for passengers. Brooks was the pilot, while Burrs and Kendall ran the business and ground operations. Now, just as a side note, Milton Burrs would continue in the airfield business. He would move his base of operations to Troy and open the Burrs Airport. You may know it today as the Oakland-Troy Airport. And that is located on the southeast of Maple and Coolidge. The Burrs Airport was actually privately owned by the Burrs family until 1968, when they sold it and opened another in Macomb County. So the Burrs family continued with that aviation tradition for generations. Now, Brooks's life changed when with a chance meeting. Brooks's father, Joseph Brooks, had an old-time band that Henry Ford was interested in hiring for dances at Bodsford Inn. Ford, who had recently jumped into the design and production of aircraft, heard about Harry from Brooks's father, and Ford set up a meeting with Harry. By August of 1925, Harry was working for Ford, and his first job was as a riveter on the Stout II A2 planes in Ford's airplane division. In January of 1926, Brooks applied for an airmail pilot certificate to fly mail, and he received it. And as soon as he received it, he was assigned as a relief pilot for the Ford company, one of only 6 pilots, and he was the youngest at 23 years old. Harry flew between Chicago and Dearborn, And it was in Chicago that he met and became friends with Charles Lindbergh. Now that'll come up soon, that friendship was important in Harry's life. In June of 1926, the new commuter plane, the Ford Model T of the sky, known as the Ford Flivver, was ready for testing, but Ford's chief pilot was too tall to fit in the Flivver. And this was Harry Brooks's chance. He was only 5'9". So he was able to fit in the Flivver and he took over. With his dashing good looks, not just my opinion, and his fearless flying as a barnstormer, he delighted the press, and they reported that the Flivver and her pilot were an innovative, fresh, and attractive creation. Ford, of course, knew that this was way too great of a promotional opportunity to pass up. Harry was given full reign over the Flivver, where he flew at state fairs. He raced cars and boats. You can see him in the air, the boat in the water. And he competed to break records all over the United States. Within 13 months, Ford saw Brooks as his flying star, and it was reported that Ford began to call him Brooksy. Now, the last Flivver appearance for the year 1926 was at the Ford Airfield in Dearborn on October 15th, when the Navy dirigible, the Los Angeles, docked at the Ford mooring mast. Thousands came out to see the ship. It was estimated over 10,000. And Harry entertained the crowds by flying the very small little Flivver around this giant 650-foot long dirigible. After this show, the Flivver was taken back to the hangars and upgraded with new wings and a deeper fuselage, ready for the 1927 season. Now, the year 1927 flew by for Brooks, pun intended, filled with exhibitions and shows. He was busy flying and working with engineers and designers on the Flivver. He was meeting and flying with Charles Lindbergh at many different locations. He even got a chance to fly the Spirit of St. Louis. And he also, during all of this, arranged for the Selfridge pilots to do a flyover for Birmingham during Birmingham's Prosperity Week. Now, while 1927 was full of adventure for Harry, two occasions stand apart from the rest. So on November 29th, Brooks landed the Flivver on Woodward Avenue. He landed it right there at Catalpa Road to speak to the Birmingham Exchange Club luncheon meeting at the Northwood Inn. Due to his regular duties at Dearborn, he was not going to make it by car to the Exchange Club talk. So he decided to take the Flivver instead, and he landed it on Woodward. He taxied it into the parking lot, parked it like you would a car, got out, gave his talk, and then jumped back in and took off from Woodward. This fully demonstrated how the Flivver could easily be a commuter plane, the Model T of the sky. The best part is the talk was on the practicability of the airplane. So it was almost like a setup. But anyway, when the Department of Commerce found out about this episode, they fined Harry between $400 or $500. Different accounts give different amounts. But reportedly, Ford told Brooksy not to worry about it, that the publicity that the exploit was worth much more in advertising than the fine. Now, just a few weeks later, Harry was chosen to fly Charles Lindbergh's mother to Mexico. Charles Lindbergh had just made the first nonstop flight linking Washington, D.C. and Mexico City. He was joining the two capitals. Lindbergh had then extended an invitation from the Mexican president to his mother, Mrs. Evangeline Lodgeland Lindbergh, to visit for Christmas. Mrs. Lindbergh turned down the invitation. She was actually a teacher at Cass Tech High, and she had to be back in time for winter break, when winter break was over, for the students. And she knew that if she took the train down to Mexico City and then back up, she would never make it in time. So she turned it down. However, W.B. Stout, the designer for the Ford Tri-Motor, proposed to Henry Ford that they fly Mrs. Lindbergh down to Mexico. And of course, he said Brooks should fly her. When Charles Lindbergh found out that Brooks would be the pilot, he approved of the plan and said, yes, come on down. Then the U.S. State Department jumped in and offered any needed assistance. And then the U.S. consul appointed Mrs. Lindbergh as ambassadress, the unofficial minister plenipotentiary of the women of the United States to Mexico. Well, at this point, Brooks could not refuse to take Mrs. Lindbergh down. So he set out with Mrs. Lindbergh, Mr. and Mrs. Stout, the head of the Ford Motor Operations, Adrian LeJoy, and his co-pilot and mechanic, Harry Russell, on Monday, December 19th, for a planned trip to Mexico City. They planned for it to take 3 days with stopovers along the way. However, the trip was plagued with bad weather the whole way down. He made it to Mexico City 4 days later and did land to great fanfare. During the 5-day stay in Mexico, Brooks made several flights in the Tri-Motor, giving rides to the President of Mexico, Mexican government officials, and Ford Motor Company officials, with Charles Lindbergh coming along for several of those rides. Now, the weather on the trip home was even worse. After leaving St. Louis on the last leg of the flight, Brooks had to make an emergency landing in Hammond, Indiana. The next day, Brooks again tried to make it to Detroit, but once again, they were forced down due to a blizzard, and they landed in a field outside of Edwardsburg, Michigan. That's where these pictures are from. The passengers were rescued from the deep snowdrifts by a local who took them by his car to spend the night in private homes in the town. As you can see, that Model T is pretty deep in the snow. The next morning, the only way to the plane was by sleigh. And you can see them digging the plane out, getting it ready to fly. However, the passengers were driven to an airfield in Sturgis, where Harry met the passengers in the Tri-Motor, and then they finally made it back home to Detroit, again, to great fanfare. And yes, that is a sombrero on that gentleman's hat in the picture. So they were having some fun digging that plane out of the snow. Now, the last flight for Brooks began on February 25th, 1928. Brooks was trying to break a record for a non-stop from Detroit to Miami in the Flivver, and he had left Detroit on February 21st. He was forced down by engine problems and adverse weather in Titusville, Florida. After working on the plane and spending a few days recovering from the effects of the extreme cold temperatures he had to endure, it is estimated that he was dealing with negative 60-degree wind chill factors at altitude. And he was suffering physically. Brooks climbed into the Flivver, circled the crowds a few times, and headed out over the Atlantic to complete his run to Miami, where Henry Ford was waiting to greet him. Brooks never made it. Witnesses described watching the plane flying low and then plunging into the waves. The wreckage of the plane was washed to shore, but after days of searching, Harry Brooks's body was never found. On March 8th, all of Birmingham shut down. Businesses were closed from 1:30 to 3:30 p.m., and flags were flown at half-staff so that all of Birmingham could attend Harry Brooks's memorial service at the Birmingham Theater. The entire family was present, along with many celebrities. The Birmingham Eccentric covered the story from the first reports of the crash to the citywide memorial. The Eccentric also printed this picture of Brooks with the quote, "The smile is one that Birmingham people are familiar with." This does ring true, as we have oral history from Charles Bingham, who says that Harry flew his plane over Birmingham so frequently that he installed speakers in it so that he could call out to his friends on the ground. Bingham was just a young boy at the time, but when Harry called out to Bingham's father from the plane, the young boy was so excited, and this would be a memory that he carried for his whole life. After Harry Brooks's death, Henry Ford ended the Flivver program, and the Flivver that crashed while it was taken back to Dearborn disappeared after that, and nobody knows where it is. The one hanging up at the Henry Ford Museum was the first one that had been redesigned for 2027. So the Ferguson women. So you probably already heard me mention Edna Ferguson in Harry Brooks's story. And her aviation story does begin with her connection to Brooks. So Edna was an only child, and she was born to John and Emma Chisis Ferguson. John's family had settled in Birmingham in the mid-1800s, and Emma's family also settled in Birmingham in the early 1800s and married into several prominent families. While most of the Ferguson family stayed in Birmingham, John and his family moved to a small farm in Southfield on Berg Road. So our third Southfield aviator that's still called Birmingham home. At this time, you have to understand, Southfield was just a farming community, and Birmingham was the center of social and shopping and things like that. So Edna did maintain a lot of contact and intimate connection to Birmingham through her family. Harry and Edna were actually connected by family and knew each other quite well. Edna's mother, Emma, had a younger brother, Robert Chisis, who married Harry's older sister, Gladys Brooks. Robert and Gladys lived on Maple Road by the Birmingham train station, and when Harry began flying, because Edna's father knew Harry so well, Edna's father mowed a landing strip on his farm so that Harry could come and visit with their friends. And that's probably how Edna became interested in learning how to fly herself. Edna began flying with Harry at the age of 15, so she was quite young. This is Edna in Curtiss Jenny. We're not sure which Jenny it is. A lot of these were floating around after World War I. It could be the one that Brown bought for him and Harry to fly. It could be one that was owned by Hoffman. We're not sure. But Edna learned how to fly the Jenny along with her friends, Brown and Burrs. Now, again, this was the Jenny that was designed by Glenn Curtiss. Now, according to Edna's family, Harry and Edna started dating, and Harry used Henry Ford's personal Lincoln to drive her around. In an interview after Brooks's death, that story was sort of corroborated when Ferguson was called a very close friend, and that Brooks was known to drive her around town and to drive her to school and to drive her to other places. Edna's family also said that Harry and Edna were eventually engaged to be married, but Harry's parents were not very happy about that situation. Harry was becoming famous as Henry Ford's test pilot, and the family was not eager to see him settle down at that time. Unfortunately, if there was an engagement, it was broken by the tragic death of Brooks. Edna was just 19 years old when Harry died, and she at first refused to believe that he was killed, hoping that he had washed up somewhere soon to return. Eventually, she accepted his death, but she was so devastated that she hung up her wings and never took to the skies again. She eventually moved on from Harry's death and married Russell Burns in 1932, and she had 2 children, including her daughter, Roberta. According to Roberta, her mother took her to a private airfield in Birmingham and they watched the planes land and take off. Now, we don't know where this airfield was or if it was in Birmingham. Again, many airstrips were just mown grass, but it is very possible that this airfield was owned by her friend Milton Burrs and was just 1 mile east of Birmingham at the Burrs airfields. Roberta, again, was just a small child, so. But in an interview decades later, Roberta reminisced about spending this time with her mother. She said, quote, "It was awesome to see. There was something romantic when they took off and when they landed. I wondered where they were going and where they had been." Oh. Okay, there we go. So Roberta grew up, she got married, and she raised her own family before she thought about becoming a pilot herself. After her children grew and left home, Roberta began working in the physics and astronomy department at the University of Iowa. This new position, and of course the stories told by her mother, inspired her to finally get her license. In 1984, she got her license and started taking her daughter, Susan Rowe Kelsey, up. So this would be Edna's granddaughter and the third generation of Ferguson women to take to the skies. Now, Susan says that she had had many memorable trips with her mother, including this one in 1993 when they landed near downtown Chicago at Meigs Field, when it was still an operating airport on the shores of Lake Michigan. Now, this airport closed in 2003, so you can't take that flight anymore. But Roberta actually said in an interview that landing at Meigs Field had its challenges as well, because you had the air traffic coming from O'Hare, from the northwest, and Midway from the southwest, and that she had to fly low because the airspace was for the larger planes. But at one point she said that the controller said, sailboat mast ahead. So now she's having to avoid sailboats and airplanes. She said that I had to do a helicopter landing to go over the mast and then land. Her daughter said it was really neat to see the skyline from that height. It was definitely a trip to remember. So after becoming a pilot, Roberta did join the 99s. This was a group of women pilots named for the first 99 women who started the organization. And these members included Amelia Earhart and Jane Briggs Hart, who we're going to learn about in just a second. She eventually became the editor and publisher for the 99 News magazine. And in 1993, she started her own magazine called Woman Pilot. This is the, up on the screen, this is the first cover of the first edition. In 2017, Roberta was awarded the 99's President's Award in recognition for her contribution to women's aviation, both in the air and on the ground. Now, Susan, her daughter, did decide to carry on the family tradition, and she also became a pilot. In an interview, Susan says, "I kept thinking as she looked over at her mom's, that's my mom there in that seat." And that inspired her to want to be in that seat as well. Now, I do want to say that I had the pleasure of working with Roberta, also known as Bobby, and her daughter Susan on this story. All these photographs were given to us by the family. Sadly, Roberta passed away in 2021. And we have had wonderful conversations with Susan and her son, Robert, afterwards, but it was sad to lose Roberta. She was a really fun woman to talk with. Now, our last aviator for the evening is Jane Briggs Hart, who was born in 1921 into one of the area's most wealthy families. Her father was Walter Briggs, and he was part of the Briggs family. And the Briggs family did have strong ties to Birmingham from the beginning of the 20th century. Jane's father was an early industrialist and is responsible for many buildings that we recognize today in Birmingham. That includes the Briggs building that sits on the southeast corner of Maple and Old Woodward, the Lululemons. And the Birmingham Theater on South Old Woodward. The Briggs family also helped found the Detroit Zoo. They provided funding to the Detroit Symphony Orchestra and the DIA, but they're probably best known for being the longest owners of the Detroit Tigers baseball team. So as a young woman, Jane earned her pilot's license at 18 in 1938, and she also joined the 99s. In 1941, the official civilian auxiliary of the Army Air Force formed to help keep the U.S. borders safe during World War II. Jane signed up, and she served as a captain during World War II. And above here in this photo, you can see is a gathering of pilots and planes taken in Lansing, Michigan in 1942. And that was the civilian, or the CAP, the Civilian Air Patrol. In 1943, she married Philip Hart and made Birmingham her home. After her marriage, Jane still continued to fly and participate in derbies across the United States. These were like fun races set up to raise money and stuff. In this news article photo that you see, it was taken just 3 weeks after Jane had a baby. She's actually getting ready to fly in a Powerpuff Derby. This derby was from Louisiana to Flint, Michigan, and was 2,366 miles. So family was not going to stop her. Jane was married for 11 years when her husband was elected as Michigan's lieutenant governor in 1954. The Hart family, which consisted of 9 children, they did have 10, but one child died as a toddler. They moved from Birmingham to Lansing at this time to be closer to the Michigan State Capitol. However, Jane maintained contacts with Birmingham. She was part of the Birmingham Women League of Voters as well. She, in 1958, became the first woman in Michigan to earn a license to fly helicopters. She then joined the Whirly Girls. This was a group of women helicopter pilots, and she was the 25th woman to join. This skill came in handy when her husband decided to run for Senate. Jane decided to personally pilot the helicopter that Hart used to go to rallies and events across Michigan. Though many people within political circles criticized her for this role, Jane refused to give up flying for the campaign. Of course, these same critics also attacked her for her appearance. The first rally she attended, she jumped out of the pilot seat wearing khaki shorts. So that, astonishing. But Jane Briggs Hart was not one to rest on convention. She did what she wanted, and that was expected by her by society. Now, Jane's aviation interest did not just end with flight here on Earth. She was also interested in the civil rights and the equal rights for women movements, and was a founder for the National Organization for Women. So when the opportunity to break the glass ceiling on space flight presented itself, Jane jumped right in. At the age of 40, Jane participated in a program at the Lovelace Clinic in New Mexico to test women to become astronauts. The program, a privately funded project, subjected 13 women to the same physical and psychological tests administered to the Mercury 7 astronauts. The 13 women, who became known as the Mercury 13, actually outperformed the male astronauts on their tests. However, NASA continued to insist that only qualified male test pilots could enter its astronaut program and refused to admit women. Now, Jane and several of the other women took their fight to be allowed to enter the astronaut program to Washington, D.C. Here you can see Jane and her friend Jerry Cobb, another of the Mercury 13, posed with a Saturn rocket on March 13th, 2 days before meeting with Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. On July 17th and 18th, 1962, Jane spoke in front of the U.S. Congress at the Special Subcommittee on the Selection of Astronauts with fellow trainee Jerry Cobb. They argued that as they passed all the same tests, with better scores even, they should be allowed into the space program. And as Jerry Cobb said, quote, "We seek only a place on our nation's space future without discrimination." They were denied simply because they were women. It took another 16 years before women were allowed to participate. Sally Ride entered the astronaut program for the class of 1978 and went to space as the first American woman in 1983. Though Jane herself never made it to space, she paved the way for other women to soar. Jane Briggs Hart continued her unapologetic fight for the rights of women and others for the rest of her life. She passed away in 2015 at the age of 93. So the first half of the 20th century, that we're going to be talking about Maurice Lohmann now. He was not an aviator, and he did not have a pilot's license. But the first half of the 20th century was a great time of experimentation in aircraft design. You know, you see the first flight of the Wright airplane made of wood and canvas, to the first successful all-metal airplane, the J-1 Casaceli. I'm sure I butchered that name as well. It was known better as the sheet metal donkey. To the experimental computer plane, the Flivver, to the jumbo-sized planes like the Hughes H-4 Hercules, aka the Spruce Goose. These were all in the first half of the 20th century. Well, Maurice Lohmann, Birmingham's very first village manager and a building engineer here in Birmingham, decided to get into the design game as well. During the late 20s and the early 30s, experimentation leaned towards finding a way to land and take off on short runways. Lohmann designed a plane that allowed the pilot to move the wings like a bird, allowing for short landings and takeoffs. It was kind of a complicated design and a little bit on the clunky side. But he applied for and received a patent in 1931, and he built this wooden model of the plane, and which we have on exhibit right now at the Birmingham Museum in our aviation exhibit. The design itself was never implemented into a working plane, however, but you can come see the wooden model if you'd like. Another type of aircraft that did see some success in this area of short landings and takeoffs was the Pitcairn autogyro, one of which was actually purchased and flown by William Scripps, who lived here in the area. Think the Scripps booth, think you know, Cranbrook. Anyway, Scripps owned the Detroit newspaper, and he used the autogyro to get to breaking news stories quickly. But he also flew it to and from his home. The autogyro was a cross between a plane and what would become a helicopter, and was made to take off and land on shorter runways. But the true no runway needed helicopter that we think of today was first flown in 1942. This, of course, changed the course of the type of aircraft design in a completely different way, kind of leaving Lohmann's model and the autogyro behind. So that is the men and women of tonight's talk, and each contributed to the advancement of aviation and transformation here in Birmingham, and to a large extent, the whole nation. This, of course, was only a glimpse into their lives. Honestly, I could have talked to you for hours, especially on Harry Brooks and Coriel. We were lucky enough to receive two not known about letters from Coriel to the Corton family just like 4 weeks ago. So we now, that totals 6 total letters that we have from him, which is very exciting. So I could talk for hours, but anyway, this was only a small glimpse into their lives, but you can always come to the museum, check out the aviation exhibit, talk to me if you want to hear more. But this is the display on aviation, which is part of our larger exhibit, Transportation and Transformation, Shaping Birmingham and Its People. Now, I do want to invite you to our next talk. It's called Literal Train Wrecks, Transportation Disasters in Birmingham. And this is going to be with Caitlin Donnelly on January 9th, and it will cover the impact that transportation accidents and catastrophes had on Birmingham. Remember, the DUR tracks ran right down the middle of Woodward. So anyway, thank you all for coming out tonight, and any questions? Any questions?
There's a question in the chat.
Okay.
Question is from Caitlin. Is it dirigible different or the same from a blimp and a zeppelin?
Okay, so the question is a dirigible different or the same from a zeppelin or a blimp? So a dirigible is any air-filled craft. So dirigible is a blimp and a zeppelin. However, or I should say a zeppelin and a blimp are both dirigibles. But a zeppelin is a rigid body aircraft. So it has a frame inside. And the Los Angeles was a true zeppelin. A blimp usually it's inflated, so it has no rigid construction. There is an in-between that's half rigid, half it's still being held up by the air pressure from the inside. And that would be, so all three types are dirigibles, but the Zeppelin is the solid frame, and a blimp is no frame. And the Hindenburg, by the way, I just wanted to point out, so that blimp that we saw, the Los Angeles, was 600 and some feet. It was 650 feet. The Hindenburg, which was, again, a Zeppelin, was 804. So over 150 feet longer. So very large. So any other questions?
Praise and thanks.
Oh, so. All right. Well, then I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and honestly, come see Caitlin's talk on literal train wrecks. It'll be pretty awesome. There were some pretty astounding disasters here in Birmingham.